This is part 2 of my Outlander Blood of My Blood Season 1 Episode 2 review. As always, if you are looking to avoid spoilers from the books or the TV show, please do keep on scrolling. So as we see Julia reach for this stack of envelopes, her hand hesitates and lowers itself to grab this particular letter, which we learn is from Henry. We can see on this little slip here that its address is to the London Times, which is located at Printing House Square in London. Historically, the London Times covered World War I day in and day out and reported on key events happening in the war, but the redaction office would have to go through all of the information that would be submitted to them and make sure that they redacted any confidential information before it went to print. When Julia turns the letter around, she can see who it is from, and we learn that Henry is a lieutenant from Regiment number 99, the 5th Battalion, and we had seen that earlier when we saw the 99 on the letter bag. What I love about this scene is that Julia opens the letter and places it down on her table like she's about to perform the redactions again, but as soon as she starts reading Henry's words, she immediately lifts the paper up from the table and is immersed in them. Henry's opening words paint a very gruesome picture, and we can physically see it affecting Julia as she reads it. And right after she reads the line, "What is there to live for?" she's interrupted by her supervisor and encouraged to keep working. I loved that we immediately clocked that for Julia, there's something really captivating about this letter. I think it's also made it very clear that Henry has a way with words. He has written beautiful letters, and the way he describes what's happening out there is really harrowing, and it hits you really hard. And so I would have done the same thing as her. I would have wanted to keep reading it too. So we see her stick it inside the hardcover copy of her biochemistry textbook to bring home with her and read later. And Henry's voiceover continues after she returns home to her flat from work, and we get a glimpse into where she lives here. Later on, we'll see this little arched window again as she looks through it, but we can see that she lives alone in London and is surrounded by textbooks and finishes reading the letter later on in the privacy of her own home. Julia, as we see, feels compelled to return the letter to Henry and write him a response. And I loved grabbing this screenshot because there are so many things inside of her apartment that give insight into who she is and what she's interested in. We can see over here she has paintings or drawings of botany. There are many textbooks and papers hung all around on the walls. And if you look closely through the archway into her kitchen, there's actually some herbs or dried flowers hanging from her ceiling, which reminded me instantly of Claire as we see those hanging all throughout her surgery. She also identifies herself as a naturalist in this scene and in the letter she's writing back to him, which is someone who focuses on the relationship between living things and the environments that they're in. So the two of them have that in common, that they're questioning why they are living through this war. But Julia believes that Mother Nature and nature will always find its way and compares what's happening to a raindrop. And again, you can just tell by the language that she uses that she's so highly educated and thinks very broadly. And you can instantly understand how the two of them would spark a chemistry through the written word with one another. I absolutely loved her use of the word alchemy here and how she talks through this element of water so eloquently and compares it to humans and how we are shaped and changed by the hardships and suffering that we go through, which is what Henry is dealing with and grappling with right now. But with her words, she reminds him that that will give him strength, and water can carve through rock. And I think if you are in the depths of despair like he is, hearing something so beautifully put and encouraging would mean the world to you. This scene also gives us a lot more insight into Julia and her family life. We learn that both of her parents have died, and she is essentially alone in the world right now. And in an effort to try and make her parents proud in their death, she paused her own studies to take up efforts in the war. I think these two introductory letters with one another are so well written, first of all, but also really paint a picture that these two people are so intelligent and that their brains work so similarly, and at this point in their lives they're both finding themselves in extremely similar scenarios where they're alone and wondering why and in need of love and support. We get this really terrifying scene where Henry is stuck in the trenches with the gas and putting his gas mask on and watching the men around him dying essentially, and you can hear his heavy breathing in this moment and how terrified he is. And when we cut back to Julia, we can see this close-up on her record player that is playing the song that we're all too familiar with, I Do Like to Be Beside the Seaside. I really do feel like the showrunners and the writers are kind of hitting us over the head with this, and for that reason, I almost feel like all of the predictions that Jamie and Claire meeting Fanny and Fanny telling them that her mother taught her this song, it's so heavily implying that it's Julia and Henry's daughter, which would make Fanny and Jane Claire's nieces, that I'm starting to think that that's not what's going to happen here. And that was reiterated by the fact that Julia thinks that she's pregnant with a boy. As Henry starts to read aloud the next letter that he wrote to Julia, we can see here, if you zoom in, that he sent it in a much different envelope than the first one. This one is one that's privately addressed. And in it, he says that her magical words produced in him a strange alchemy that gave him a glimmer of hope. So there's that word, alchemy, again. I also love that the way these scenes are shot, it's layering all of their correspondence. So we get little sentences from each of their letters back and forth, and it implies the passage of time really beautifully. I loved that in this particular letter, Henry has someone teasing him over his shoulder as he reads her response, and we see a smile on his face again. Julia also asks him about his brother, so we can tell from this that the two of them have started sharing more personal information with one another, and Julia asks if he's uncovered another Egyptian pharaoh, which is a little callback to the books. And Henry asks Julia if she's still in her Scottish phase because she's been reading a lot of books lately. When she tells Henry that she loves Scotland's flora and fauna, it's such a direct callback to Claire, because we know when she went up there with Frank in season 1, she was just getting into botany seriously for the first time and making a point to explore its flora and fauna. And as she describes Scotland as being indescribably romantic, this is when we start to see that Henry is sealing his letters with a kiss. And as I mentioned before, this is an up-close shot of the way that he is sending his letters from now on, which is directly to Julia here. And if you zoom in and read all of these details on here, Henry signs his signature on the left-hand side, which is how it's marked as a very private matter, and so it's not to be read by anyone other than Julia. Julia mentions a folklorist named J.F. Campbell. That was a real person named John Francis Campbell, and he had written about the stone circles and the fairies, which again, Claire went through similar things when she was at Castle Leoch, learning about the folklore behind the standing stones. But it's interesting to consider that both Julia and Henry would have talked about this stone circle before their trip to the Scottish Highlands. And she says that this man describes the feeling of going into the stone circle and coming out as being gone for only a moment, but in actuality it's been years, and that's how their letters feel to Julia. And the camera pans across the stack of all these envelopes, and we end on this one right here that, as we can see, says SWAK, sealed with a kiss, which has become their signature for one another. By this point in their correspondence, I think both Julia and Henry have identified the fact that there's something more going on between them here, and as Henry points out, he feels as though in her he's found a soulmate. Julia tells Henry that her heart is with him out on the battlefield, even though she longs to go to Scotland. He offers to Julia that he come to London in the next month or so if his leave is granted by his commanding officer, just at the same time that we can see in London, where Julia is in her flat, that the air raids are starting to take place. I think practically, from a standpoint of cinematography, the practical effects on this shot are insanely well executed, and you share her worry because we know that her flat is on the very top floor of this building. And so as the war carries on and Julia continues to write during the blackouts at night, and she tells Henry that her greatest fear is never getting the chance to meet him. And we can see how her letters are saving Henry, because just as he receives this letter and puts it in his hands and walks away, there is an explosion right where he was just standing. And that is when he decides to call Julia his hope. Then there's 2.5 weeks where Julia doesn't hear a word from Henry. And we assume the worst because there's all this somber music playing and Morse code being passed. And we can see here that in Passchendaele there were a number of casualties, including from Regiment number 99, which she knew Henry was in. And there were 1,399 men that were killed. And I love that she says that hope is their byword that they share between one another, and she holds on to that. And it's a good thing because as we see in this scene here, when the two of them cross paths finally, they instantly know it's the other one. So come back for part 3 where we break